Welcome back everyone to our series on the Daedric Princes of the Elder Scrolls. Today we're covering one of my favourite of the princes, the Prince of Bargains and Trickery, Clavicus Vile. Vile, much like Nocturnal, who we covered last time, is another prince with immense potential power, though unlike Nocturnal, this potential isn't mired by mystery and the unknown, no. With Vile, it comes down to his other half, Barbas. Barbas is both Vile's hound and quite literally his other half, but we'll get to that in time. As always with the series, we'll be delving into the lore, one game and this time book at a time in release order, to see how the lore expands and is built upon over time. And of course, this is, as always, an audio-focused experience, so feel free to have it on in the background. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and let's get started. This time we begin with Daggerfall. Here we summon Vile on his summoning day, the 1st of Morning Star. He will give a rather simple task, to kill a werewolf. The only thing of particular note from Vile during this conversation is that he will tell the player that werewolves are usually friendly with him and his associates. This one notwithstanding, of course. The reward here is the Mask of Clavicus, as it is called in this game. The mask in-game simply improves the player's reputation as its representation of the mask's power, to make the wearer more respected, more charming, and all around more charismatic and magnetic. Certainly a fitting tool to be the prized artifact of the Daedric Prince of Deals. Now, something I've failed to mention in previous videos is exactly how some Daedric artifacts come into being. According to the book Darkest Darkness, which appears in every mainline game after Daggerfall, the Mask, as well as Mehrunes Razor, which we've covered previously, are examples of artifacts created by the Daedric Lords, binding the souls of lesser Daedra. Essentially, they are formed from a very advanced version of the bound weapon and armor spells we find across the series. These artifacts, however, are created in a way that allows them to be fully corporeal and, as far as we know, permanently so. Our only other main source of information, outside of what the player experiences across the series in relation to the mask, comes from the book Famed Artifacts of Tamriel by Yagrum Brigar, or Tamrielic lore as it more commonly goes by. The mask's entry goes as follows. Ever the vain one, Clavicus Vile made a mask suited to his own personality. The bearer of the mask is more likely to get a positive response from the people of Tamriel. The higher his personality, the larger the bonus. The best-known story of the mask tells the tale of Evelia, a noblewoman of some renown. As a young girl, she was grossly disfigured by a spiteful servant. Evelia made a dark deal with Clavicus Vile and received the mask in return. Though the mask did not change her looks, suddenly she had the respect and admiration of everyone. A year and a day after her marriage to a well-connected baron, Clavicus Vile reclaimed the mask. Although pregnant with his child, Evelia was banished from the baron's household. 21 years and 1 day later, Evelia's daughter claimed her vengeance by slaying the baron. But back to Daggerfall. If you ask NPCs in-game about Vile, you get a response saying that Vile is the most neutral of all the princes, and I think I'd probably agree with that. Vile certainly does evil things, but it's almost always in the form of a tricky deal, and almost always out of pure self-interest or just complete apathy. Or, as we learned from talking to him in Redguard, which isn't a game I tend to mention too often in this series, he does it out of boredom. He finds meddling with mortals entertaining. He isn't trying to overthrow a civilization or wipe out an organization or bloodline. He's just bored and seeing what happens. Even within Redguard, he is a significant roadblock, and yet it's all just entertainment for him. Apparently, Eternity gets boring. But having said all of this, as we'll get into much later, he will team up with his fellow prince from time to time. But moving on to Morrowind, this one surprisingly doesn't offer as much in the way of Vile himself, but it does introduce us to another of his artifacts, the Bitter Cup. The Bitter Cup is an artifact that, when picked up, will give you the option to raise your highest attribute by 20 points and lower your lowest attribute by 20 points. Another rather fitting trade-off for an artifact of Vials. But that's pretty much all Morrowind gives us, aside from the Book of Daedra, which just lists all of their spheres, Vials being the granting of power and wishes through ritual invocations and acts, according to the text. Oh, also there's a scamp in Caldera who sells you stuff who might be Barbas, but we'll learn more about Barbas when we head through our next few pieces of media. And first up, it's Oblivion. Well, actually, there is one other thing in Morrowind, but it's not stated to have any connection to Vile in that game, so we'll cover it in Oblivion instead. Oblivion takes us back to our classic summoning, this time on any day for a mere 500 gold. Vile will speak to the player and ask for them to retrieve a sword that he says contains the soul of Umbra. He doesn't give any more details than that, but this is the Morrowind connection mentioned previously. Umbra was a character you could fight in Morrowind. No connection to Vile was given at the time, they were just a strong enemy. But we'll save covering the sword for the next section. For now, let's get back to Oblivion, and of course, I couldn't make this section without giving credit to the wonderful talent of Todd Howard for the voice acting here, but did you know that he also voiced Vile in Redguard 8 years prior? The more you know. Once you finish talking to Vile, Barbas' statue will vanish and he'll begin speaking to you. Barbas is, in my opinion, the most interesting part about Vile. Barbas, despite generally acting as a loyal servant to Vile, is said to actually contain half of Vile's power, and again, despite this servant-like role, often works against his master's wishes, though for his own good. According to the book The Vile Truth of Barbas, Vile and Barbas are simply the same being in two halves. Which does make some sense, as is also mentioned in the book, Barbas is the only Daedra aside from the other princes who can change their physical form and retain their fundamental identity. The book also posits the theory that Vile did this as he himself is simply too social to exist as one being, so he created out of himself a companion for himself. Now, Barbas will spend his time in this quest trying to convince the player not to return the sword to Vile. Barbas claims that things with the sword never end well, but of course you go and kill the person with the sword, also called Umbra, and you take it back to Vile. And you do take it back to Vile. Yes, in-game you can choose to keep the sword or not fight Umbra at all, but we at the very least know that Vile does get the sword back somehow, so the most logical conclusion is that giving him the sword is the canon ending for that quest, despite all of Barbas' warnings. And they were certainly very warranted warnings, as we'll find out soon. And now, for the first time in this series, we come to a book rather than a game. Two books, in fact. The Infernal City and Lord of Souls by Greg Keyes. Now, I don't know if you guys have heard all these rumors about an Elder Scrolls TV show after the success of the Fallout one, but I think if they were going to do anything, they should do an adaptation of these books. They are not only compelling stories in their own right, but they contain some of the more esoteric aspects of the Elder Scrolls series that a show would ideally explore to stop it from feeling like generic fantasy. But also, it's really significant to the lore, and most people just haven't read it. The book covers not only what happens to the Sword Umbra and aspects of the Hist and the aftermath and downfall of the Tribunal and subsequent disappearance of Vivek, but it also covers things like why Red Mountain erupts, which is hugely significant and has disastrous effects on Morrowind and has incredibly far-reaching consequences like the mass immigration of the Dunmer, which is why we see things like the Grey Quarter in Skyrim, or why Solstheim is full of ash and heartstones and the like. My only real worry with an adaptation like this is it potentially being a little too lore-heavy for mass appeal, but I'm sure that's nothing a talented team couldn't work out. But let me know your thoughts on that. Anyway, tangent over, let's get back to Vile and Umbra. Now we get a little information in the aforementioned Tamrielic lore by Yagran Begarn, but it is expanded upon, particularly in the second novel, Lord of Souls. The sword was said to have been created by the witch Nyenra, who was called upon by Vile to create a sword that would feed him souls. Now, Nyenra is sometimes believed to be Sheogorath in disguise, which would be fitting as she told Vile that he had to give the sword a piece of his power, and when he did, the sword became a sentient being. Nyenra was reportedly executed for this, but the sword persisted, slowly possessing whoever wielded it. Now, fast forward to the 4th era, and the Dark Elves are trying to figure out how to stop the floating rock Bardau from crashing into Vivec City now that Vivec is no longer there. A device was created called the Ingenium, which worked by essentially paying Vile with souls. The device made a connection to his realm, the Fields of Regret, and the energy flowed through to keep the rock in place, a win-win for everyone. Well, except the people getting sacrificed, but hey, read the book for that. Anyway, some plot happens, and the Ingenium doesn't get a soul, and it gets destroyed, and a rift opens to Vile's realm that pulls some stuff in. The Fields of Regret, by the way, are apparently lovely, as they reflect Vile's view of himself as a nice, playful deity. It's full of green grass and clear skies, and is said to be filled with beautiful cities made of glass. Now, in Vile's realm, Umbra has stolen enough of Vile's power to manifest itself a body made of dark, swirly Clavicus energy stuff. And so Clavicus, afraid that Umbra would leave with his power, blocked off the realm, and so Umbra went into hiding. Fast forward to when all this Ingenium stuff happens, and it notices all these souls flooding into the realm. So what's a sentient blade to do? Well, they go and investigate, and they realize that that is their way out. The destruction of the Ingenium changed these plans slightly, however, though luckily for Umbra, one of the things to get sucked through the rift was the one person, probably, who could make them a new Ingenium, and so Umbra captured him, and they created the floating island of Umbriel. The island was powered by souls, of course, but this time it simply killed whoever was below it. Now, by this point, Umbra has taken over Wuhan, the Ingenium building dude, and began calling itself Umbriel, much like the island. Now, the island was home to a race of sentient trees who were able to connect with the Hist trees on Tamriel to sort of pull itself through to Nirn from Vile's realm. There is more to it than that, but the point is the city was now out of Vile's realm, and it was headed for the White Gold Tower, as Umbriel, the being, wanted to use it to become its own entity. Now, a lot happens after this point, but essentially Vile is weakened, and so he makes a deal to help defeat Umbriel, which they do, the sword disappearing in a cloud of black smoke as they do so. And then Vile tries to drain the main character's souls and drop the island onto the Imperial City, but they were able to banish Vile with the help of the Hist before he could, and as far as we know, the island still remains in the realm of the Hist. Vile did, however, manage to absorb all the souls from the new Ingenium to replenish the power Umbra had taken from him. The sword does show up again in Skyrim, which we'll be covering next, but it's Creation Club content, and we don't do that here. But speaking of Skyrim, that is where we next find Vile. We find him here weakened once again, though this time it's apparently due to an argument with Barbas, perhaps due to a big fat "I told you so" regarding the sword. Now, this is actually one of my favourite quests in Skyrim. We've seen already that making a deal with Vile can be a bad move, but this quest really doubles down on it. To start off, you kill Vile's followers, and he tells you that they begged him for a cure to vampirism, and you killing them was indeed that cure. Then you're sent to retrieve an axe. Barbus can tell you that it was given to Sebastian Lort, a man who begged Vile to give him a cure for his daughter's lycanthropy, and so Vile gave him an axe. This quest makes it very clear not to trust Vile, and if at the end you accept his deal to kill Barbus so he can absorb his power, you are rewarded with the axe, which is quite possibly the worst weapon in the game. But there is some more rather interesting dialogue from Vile. He says during the quest that if he was at full power, he'd be able to do things like killing everyone in Skyrim with the snap of his fingers, but Barbus acts as his morality to a degree. Now, assuming he's not exaggerating, this does potentially make Vile one of the most powerful of the Daedric princes. It's just that he has to get his power to agree with him. But he does seem to be able to do quite a lot, especially once a deal is struck. But now it's time for everyone's favourite part of these videos. The part where I just get all my information straight from the wiki because I don't want to play ESO. The most relevant information when it comes to Vile seems to be from when he granted a wish for infinite ebony. When an owner of a mine wished for a limitless supply of ebony, Vile granted it by providing an alchemical formula that transformed living people into false ebony. When the mine later passed to House Hlalu, the alchemist Gavros refined this formula into a vapor that could rapidly convert miners into creatures that eventually hardened into ebony-like statues, turning the mine into essentially a factory of living raw material, until even Gavros himself was consumed by this invention. Of course, the player shows up to take the formula to stop this from happening to anyone else, but it's just another example of how Vile twists his deals in whatever way he can. Now, of course, Vile's other big plot point is that he was a part of the triad of Nocturnal, Mephala, and himself. But I covered this whole plot in the Nocturnal video, and as I said there, I don't particularly like it. So you can watch that video for more clarity, but I won't be covering it here. One thing I will cover from ESO, however, is an artifact known as the monochrome paintbrush. The story of the brush goes that there was once a talented painter who was never able to create what she wanted as the colors simply weren't enough to capture her art. Then one day a merchant appeared and gave to her a brush that would bring her work to life, and indeed it did. But this being an artifact of Vile, it had a price. As she painted, unbeknownst to her, she was dying, her whole body becoming monochrome. And as she made her last brushstroke, she died, and left behind was the most beautiful painting ever seen. The brush is now kept in a vault by the Sigic Order. And finally, in a similar vein, is an artifact that I didn't know where else to include because there's no record of its actual existence, only a story. The artifact is very similar, but instead of a paintbrush, it is a quill. A quill that is said to make any writing as beautiful as it could possibly be, both to read and simply to look at. But instead of just killing you like the paintbrush, it controls your thoughts, and in the story, which you can read in the 3 volumes of the book Faithfulken, named the same as the artifact, it drives the elf Tharbad to take his own life. There's obviously more to the story, like Tharbad being mute and whatnot, that influences certain things, but again, this is 3 volumes and not strictly relevant, so I'd advise you to read them for yourself if you're interested. But that does bring us to the end. So, what's the conclusion to draw here? No matter the deal you think you're entering with Vile, there is always a price somewhere. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Holy shit, he's just an Elder Scrolls tech support scammer, isn't he?